it comes to consolizing Nintendo's Game Boy Advance handheld system, there doesn't seem to be any shortage of options to make that happen. The GBA is certainly the most consolized handheld out there, and having all these options can sometimes feel overwhelming. Well, one of the metrics we can look at to gauge the performance of these kits is what we call input lag, which is the amount of time it takes from when we push a button to seeing the corresponding action on screen. So today, let's look at 5 popular consolizing kits and see how much input lag each one has. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today we got a bit of a different video. Instead of doing the usual mod, we'll actually be taking a look at input lag and how it impacts some consolizing kits for the Game Boy Advance. Now right off the bat you may be asking, what on earth is input lag and how will we be measuring this metric? Well, the definition of input lag according to Wikipedia is the amount of time that passes between sending an electrical signal and the occurrence of a corresponding action. Basically, in video game terms, we're talking about the amount of time from when we press a button on the controller to when that action initiated by the button press appears on our display. By and large, the amount of time we're talking about are mere milliseconds and nearly impossible to measure using the naked eye, which brings me to how we'll be conducting these tests. Now, the procedure to measure input lag that I'll be using was not developed by me. Rather, it comes from a familiar face in the retro gaming scene, Bob of RetroTGB, an input lag connoisseur and a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the subject. So who better to explain the process than Bob himself? He'll explain the method that I'll be using to test these consolizers, as well as other useful information as it relates to the topic of input lag.
In order to perform these tests, Tito is going to be using an LED kit designed by Steve from HD Retrovision that turns off an LED light when a button is pressed. Then he'll be using a 1000 frame per second camera to measure how long it takes from when the LED starts to dim, signifying when the button is pressed, to when there's movement on screen. 1000 frames per second will come out to about 1 millisecond per frame, meaning that this is going to be a very accurate but pretty time-consuming test in order to perform. If you're just curious how much latency your display is adding, picking up something like a time sleuth is by far the easiest because you just plug it directly into the input and hold the sensor up to the screen in order to get your reading. Also, if you're only concerned with testing wireless controller or controller adapter lag, you could use an oscilloscope and follow a guide that's posted, or you could even use the Mr. FPGA project, which, when combined with a little bit of homebrew hardware, is able to generate thousands of button presses over just a few moments that would get you extremely accurate readings down to just a percentage of a millisecond. I think what makes this LED test so important, though, is that you're testing the entire setup from the time you push the button till the time you get movement on screen, which means this will work great for testing handheld latency, retro consoles, or you could even use this exact same test setup to take 2 brand new games and test the latency difference between Xbox and PlayStation. So overall, this is something that I truly think, while it's a ton of work, is really worth doing because you get a very accurate sense of how much latency is in your total setup.
Thanks, Bob, for helping set the stage for this test, and also a huge thank you for lending me all the equipment necessary to actually run these tests. Speaking of which, let's go over each piece of equipment that we'll be using real quick. Now, in order to help ensure the accuracy of our results, we want all equipment in our AV chain to not introduce lag into the tests and skew the results. Although, to be fair, we're using the same setup for each console, meaning that they'll all be subject to the same testing environment, normalizing the results. Regardless, to help minimize any external factors contributing to input lag, we'll be using a CRT monitor. Sony's BVMs and PVM CRTs, like this one here, are all zero lag devices in all resolutions, which has been confirmed many times with a time sleuth lag testing device. This particular model can accept a 720p video signal, which is crucial for this test since all these units output that resolution. Additionally, we need to be able to connect the HDMI output of each consolizer to the CRT monitor, which, as you may expect, doesn't have an input for HDMI. So to remedy this, we'll be using this HDMI to component adapter, which again Bob has extensively tested, concluding that it does not introduce any lag. And of course, to capture our results, we'll be using this high frame rate Sony camera, which can shoot short videos at 1000 frames per second. This will help us record the precise time between our button press and the corresponding action showing up on our CRT display. To ensure we're gathering good data, we'll be conducting the input latency test 6 times for each console in order to get a decent sample set, as well as avoid potential outliers in the test results. Now, for whatever reason, the Intec kit was not compatible with this testing setup, so I used the results of Bob's tests when he lag tested this unit a little while back. He ran a sample of 5 tests on a low latency panel, which should be more than enough for the purposes of this video. And for comparison purposes, I also set up this completely stock, unmodified GBA to see what kind of inherent input lag the system exhibits on its non-backlit, transflective display. This will give us a good baseline to see what input lag we all experienced as kids playing this console, and be able to compare them to the results of the tested Consolizers to help put the results into perspective. Now, before we run these tests, let's do a quick rundown of each of our contestants. Now, I've actually covered each of these Consolizing kits on my channel, showcasing all their features and doing a detailed tutorial on how to assemble them. I'll have those videos linked in the video description below if you want to check them out. So, in no particular order, let's start with the first one, which happens to be the OG Consolizing kit, Woozle's Consolizer. This one needs no introduction. It started the whole Consolizing trend for the GBA and has for a while been the gold standard for these types of kits. Our next subject is what I call the Dockable GBA Consolizer, and it's actually a combination of 2 kits. The first kit adds an internal HDMI video out capability, as well as a beautiful IPS screen. And the second kit adds support for an external controller through its dock. This is a neat kit since it gives the GBA a sort of switch-like functionality. You can take it on the go, or hook it up to your TV using the dock and play it in your living room setup. I'm pretty curious to see how this one performs. Now, this kit here is really cool. This is Zwenergy's GBA HD. It's actually an open source project, but this particular kit is actually designed by the folks over at Consoles for You in Switzerland, and it's really well put together. This next duo of Consolizing kits comes from the folks over at GameBox Systems. This is their GBHD line of Consolizers. This one here is the GBHD Advance, which utilizes an original GBA motherboard, and the other one is actually really interesting because it utilizes a motherboard from an SP, which gives it an overall pretty small footprint. And the last kit we'll be looking at is this one here from Intec Gaming. What makes this kit unique is how they went about the installation process. It requires 0 soldering, which is great, and instead relies on these pogo pins to make all the necessary connections for external controller support. A very cool and novel approach to these kinds of kits. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll also be running a latency test on a completely unmodified Game Boy Advance console. This thing has absolutely nothing done to it except for the LED indicator, which turns off when I press the A button, which of course is needed for our testing rig. Now, before we head into the test portion of the video, I just want to let you know that I put timestamps for each Consolizer test in the video description. So feel free to skip around and check out the Consolizer you're interested in, or you can watch them all. Or you can just skip to the end to see the summary of the results. Anyway, without any further ado, let's put these Consolizer kits through their paces. Okay, so for our first test run, I'll give you a quick run through of the testing procedure. Using the 1000 frame per second camera allows us to slow down the footage and see the precise moment I press the A button, which will be indicated by this LED here turning off. As you can see, at the moment, the LED is fully illuminated. Let's go ahead and proceed with the footage. The other thing you should notice is the CRT drawing each frame. This will become important in just a moment. Okay, now pay attention to the LED. We see that it turns off now. This is the precise moment that I fully pressed the A button. Now the timer on the CRT should stop, but as you'll see once we resume the footage, is that there is a bit of a delay. Right now we see the timer is on 23. We're going to go ahead and count the frames until the timer stops. But before we roll the footage, you'll notice that the LED turned off in the middle of the CRT drawing a frame, shown by the white beam of light in the middle of the screen. So we'll let the CRT finish drawing the current frame before we start our count. Okay, let's roll the footage. And quick pause. The CRT just finished drawing the frame and is about to start a new one, which will initiate our count. Let's see how many frames are drawn before the timer stops. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, as you can see, the timer stopped at 27, even as the footage continues. Remember, we started on the number 23, so that means 4 frames were drawn, and thus there's about 4 frames of lag from when we pushed the A button to when our timer stopped. So that's pretty much how these tests will be run moving forward. This was just a quick walkthrough to show you what to expect. Now, like I said previously, I have the footage for all the tests to showcase the results in this video. You can either watch them in their entirety, which is pretty long, or skip around to the Consolizer that you're interested in seeing. All the relevant timestamps are in the video description, so with that said, enjoy the tests. Oh, and just a quick note, this stopwatch timer application that I'm using for these tests is part of the 240p test suite for the Game Boy Advance. Alright, so now this is the lag test for a completely unmodified GBA. I think you'll find these results pretty interesting, and more importantly, what we find here will be a good barometer to compare the results of the other Consolizer tests. Seeing the lag of a stock unit compared to the Consolizers will show how many additional frames are added when the GBA has been modified. So here's a summary of the results. It's definitely interesting to see how many frames of latency each of these kits exhibit. It's also clear that some consoles perform better than others with regard to input lag. Both Woozle's Consolizer kit and Zwenergy's GBA HD kit sit at the top of the list with an average measurement of 1.6 frames from button press to on-screen action. The funny thing about this is that an unmodified Game Boy Advance averaged 2.4 frames until the on-screen action, which means the GBA's original screen added about 1 frame of lag to gameplay. It's actually crazy to think that these two Consolizing kits have less latency than an original unmodified Game Boy Advance. The two GameBox systems posted similar results to each other, with the gbaHD Advance and gbaHD SP showing 3.4 and 4 frames until on-screen action respectively. The Dockable Game Boy Advance recorded 4.4 frames, while the Intec kit had the highest of the pack with an average of 6.2. I definitely think these are some pretty interesting results, and the method for testing, in my opinion, worked out pretty well. Now, according to Bob, more accurate results could be achieved. However, it would require a pretty huge effort and a significantly more complex process. It would involve writing custom software, using a scope, and wiring a bunch of stuff to build an appropriate test bench. So while there are ways to get higher fidelity results, this method provides a pretty good measure of input lag that you can apply to real-world gaming scenarios. So now that we have these results, what does it all mean? Well, as with all products, each has their own set of strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. Taking a look at input lag is just another way to measure a kit's performance. It is one of many aspects that we can measure. On their website, Intel states that anything under 40 milliseconds of input lag, or roughly 2.4 frames, is a comfortable amount for a casual and enthusiast gamer. Beyond 50 milliseconds, or 3 frames, the input lag becomes noticeable to some, and anything beyond 70 milliseconds, or 4.2 frames, is considered poor performance. A casual player may agree with Intel's marketing, while speedrunners, pro gamers, and fighting game enthusiasts will definitely detect latency at lower numbers and require the lowest latency option available. One could say that we're splitting hairs here and that these results don't make much of a difference. While I agree that most may not notice a significant difference, especially when playing slow-paced games like a turn-based RPG, people who play games that rely heavily on timing and precision, like fighting games, would definitely notice a difference. Heck, there are even those who can notice a 2-frame delay while playing Mario Kart. These are the people that I would argue would find this to be a very important factor in their purchasing decision. We must also realize that other factors, such as price, ease of installation, availability, etc., that all plays into that decision process as well. And input lag for some is also an important one to consider. So there you have it, the input lag test results of 5 Game Boy Advance Consolizers. Were these the results you were expecting? And if not, let me know down below in the comments. And again, huge thank you to Bob for helping me make this video possible. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again next Thursday.